have arrived at last at the most complex systems in the natural world, living systems. In the final 18 lectures of this series, I'm going to focus on life. Perhaps the first and most basic principle that separates life from non-life is that all life on Earth has the ability to obtain matter and energy from its environment, to grow, and to reproduce with variations. In this introductory lecture, I have three basic objectives. First, I want to review 6 characteristics that are shared by all living things on Earth. Next, we're going to look at some of the varied ways to study living systems, to study the biological world. And finally, I'll introduce the subject of taxonomy, the very important, if often tedious, task of naming living objects. As a prelude, let's think about the nature of science in the context of life. Many different ways exist to describe the human endeavor of science, and we've looked at many of these throughout this lecture series. We can define the scientific method, for example. We can look at this cycle of making observations, looking for patterns and systematic principles that occur, then forming hypotheses, making predictions, collecting more data. We can also enumerate the branches of science, talk about physics and chemistry and biology as separate disciplines. We can also draw various distinctions, for example, between experiments where we manipulate the natural world and theory where we use mathematical reasoning to try to come to terms with the natural world. Or pure versus applied science, pure science being basic research that has no practical objectives, but applied science where we're trying to solve very specific questions to help humankind. We can also look at reductionism versus the study of complexity. Reductionism attempts to describe the natural world in terms of the most basic fundamental units, whereas complexity recognizes that there are certain emergent properties, large-scale properties like consciousness, which arise out of complex systems, which never could be predicted, at least so we think, from the smallest parts. Well, as we begin to think about biology, it's useful to think about science as a two-step process. The first step is to look at the basic laws of forces, of motion, of matter and energy, the laws that apply to all systems, because living systems are just one kind of system within the larger context of the natural world. Then the second step is applying that understanding to the specific natural systems, for example, collections of atoms, or a star, or a living organism. And both of these steps are essential to modern biological research. Now, living organisms are by far nature's most complex systems. And all the while, it's worth remembering, however, that living systems must obey the basic natural laws, the laws of thermodynamics, the laws of motion. They're influenced by gravity. They're influenced by electromagnetism. This is perhaps the most important concept in biology, that biological systems are just like any other natural systems in their requirement to obey those natural laws. Well, now to the first of our 3 topics. The most basic question in biology must be, what is life? And it might surprise you to learn that in spite of thousands of years of study of living systems, there's not one definition that has been widely accepted. No one can give an exact definition of life. You might say, oh, I know life when I see it, but it turns out that many of the traits we associate with living things are not observed in all life forms. And furthermore, many objects are clearly not alive, even though they have aspects of living things. Well, you know that birds are alive, you know that dogs are alive, but of course, not all living things move. And by the same token, there's some things that aren't alive, like streams and rivers, like fire, that appears to move, but isn't alive. So coming up with a precise definition of life is not such a simple matter. Now, many biologists would argue that it's impossible to define life in any simple way, but nevertheless, there are 6 traits that are shared by all living organisms. And if you set down those 6 traits and understand their characteristics, it is possible then to come up with a definition that at least is a working or operational definition that's useful in our discussion of living things. So let's look at these 6 characteristics. Well, first of all known organisms are highly complex chemical systems. They have thousands of interdependent molecular components. The simplest life form is far more complex than the most advanced products of any human technology, and will be for at least hundreds of years to come, I suspect. In terms of the chemistry of life, we have a term called metabolism. It's the collective chemical repertoire of a living organism. Even the simplest life forms are capable of hundreds of different chemical reactions. And these reactions wouldn't occur otherwise in nature. They don't occur spontaneously. They only occur in living things. Most of life's chemical reactions require enzymes. These are molecular catalysts. They greatly increase the efficiency of reactions, and the catalyst, or the enzyme itself, is a molecule that does not change in the process of facilitating that chemical reaction. Okay, the second characteristic of all life. All organisms are composed of cells, which is the unit in which metabolism occurs. Many organisms, including bacteria and yeast, are single-celled organisms. But most known species, including all the plants and all the animals, are multicellular, composed of many cells, sometimes tens or hundreds of trillions of cells collected together in a single organism. A human being, for example, contains about 100 trillion cells. Well, third, all organisms obtain and they use energy. Energy is the ability to do work, to exert a force over a distance, recall. So every organism needs to feed, it needs to grow, it needs to reproduce, and so it has to have energy. Plants and many single-celled organisms obtain their energy directly from the sun through a process called photosynthesis. Most animals, on the other hand, obtain energy directly or indirectly from plants. They eat plants, or they eat organisms that have eaten plants, and so forth. Now, there are a few simple one-celled organisms that have been found to get their energy directly from Earth's inner heat. They get the energy from chemistry. In fact, they eat rocks, essentially. These are fascinating organisms about which we'll learn more in a later lecture. The fourth characteristic of all life on Earth is that all organisms reproduce using the same genetic mechanism. A genetic mechanism is a way of processing information, passing that information from one generation to the next to the next. And it turns out that this aspect of information passing from one generation to another is key to all organisms. There are three characteristics about this genetic code you should remember. The first is that each individual reproduces its own species. Like begets like. The second is that offspring inherit genetic instructions from their parents through a molecule called DNA, and it's actually a molecule, DNA, that carries information that passes from one generation to the next. And finally, the genetic information of offspring can differ from that of the parents. And this gives you a way of reproduction with variation. And that variation is key to living things. The fact that one generation can differ slightly from the previous. The fifth characteristic of all life. All organisms grow and develop. Most organisms change form and capabilities as they get larger. So, for example, a seed develops into a flower. A fertilized human egg, a single cell fertilized human egg, develops into 100 trillion cells that are a human being. Now, this implies that all organisms have to gather atoms, and they have to gather energy. There's no way you can go from a single cell to 100 trillion cells unless you use a lot of energy and a lot of new atoms and molecules in the process. Well, then the sixth characteristic of all life is that all organisms respond to changes in their external environment, while they maintain a relatively constant internal environment. So this point has a couple of subtexts here. First of all, there has to be an inside and an outside to all living things. The inside is in some way controlled chemically and physically. And furthermore, organisms can respond in significant ways to the external influence. Some of these are obvious. Larger animals, for example, may cause smaller animals to scurry away. That's a kind of response to your environment. But plants also respond to environmental changes. For example, the direction of the flowers following the sun. The fact that roots, as they penetrate deep into the ground, will change their direction seeking for water or going around obstacles. Well, so we've seen 6 characteristics, and let's summarize these. First, all living things on Earth are complex chemical systems. Second, they're all composed of cells. Third, they all use energy. fourth, they all reproduce with variations using the same genetic mechanism of DNA. All organisms grow and develop. And finally, all organisms respond to their environment. In the second segment of this lecture, I want to consider the different ways of thinking about living things, at least from a scientific point of view. Now, clearly, there are many, many different ways of thinking about life. On the one hand, you could examine all of these 6 traits that are common to all living things, and you could have sort of 6 lectures, one on each of these traits. So chemical complexity or genetic processes, homeostasis, the process of maintaining the internal environment, and so forth. But there are also other approaches to biology. I want you to think about how you might study an ant. If someone said, I want you to learn everything you can about an ant, how would you go about studying it? Well, of course, you could start just with a single ant. You could take a microscope. You could look at the ant under a microscope. You could see its external segments. You could look perhaps at its internal organs if you had a high enough power microscope. And you could do anatomical studies. Now, you need lots of nomenclature to do this. You'd have to name all the different parts of the ant. You'd have to be able to look at the structures and see how they function. This would be a very basic description of the physical characteristics of an ant. You could go farther. You could study the ant at the cellular level, because all organisms, including ants, are made of cells. And ants are made of many millions of cells. Documenting how those different cells perform different functions would then be a key to understanding the behavior of an ant. You might want to know how the ant developed from a single cell, for example. All organisms, all animals begin with a single cell, and then multicellular organisms have to develop from that. So how does that process happen? Then you could go even farther. You could look at the ant from a molecular level. How do the different molecules, how do the different chemical reactions occur in the ant? Indeed, what about the genetic characteristics of an ant? What are the genes that carry information from one generation to another? That's also molecular information. So we're getting at finer and finer scales for the ant. But even if you knew everything there was to know about an individual ant and its cells and its genes, that wouldn't tell you that much about an ant in terms of larger systems. For example, an ant colony. And so you can study ants at many larger scales. You can study the behavior of ant colonies, so insect sociobiology, if you will. Then you can study the interaction of one ant colony with its surroundings, with other ant colonies, with its food sources, with the plants and animals that live in that area, entire ecosystems. Ultimately, you can actually study the behavior of ants in the context of the global environment and ecosystem, because ants are a very populous member of the animal species. There are lots of ants, and they do affect the global ecosystem. So here's the largest scale of understanding ants. You can also think about biology from the point of view of questions, another way of thinking about biological systems. Recall from the very first lecture of this series that we said that there are 4 broad categories of scientific questions. First, we had existence questions, just the process of describing what's out there in the natural world. What are all the different species of ants, of other insects, of plants? Then you ask origin questions. How do things arise? Third, we had process questions. How do they work? What are the mechanisms by which objects change in a dynamic sort of sense? Because our natural world is a very dynamic place. And we had a 4th class of questions, applied questions. Questions that have to do with specific human needs and opportunities to improve the human condition. So let's look in detail about how these 4 kinds of questions apply to living systems. Well, existence questions. First and foremost, biologists worry about what's out there. What plants, what animals, what microorganisms. This has played a central role in biology for thousands of years, long before people talked about biology or long before they talked about science. Humans wondered what sorts of plants and animals were out there because they were useful, they were food, they were medicines. Exploring expeditions of the 18th and 19th century always had a naturalist along to describe plants and animals. For example, Charles Darwin's first job was as a naturalist on the HMS Beagle. That was a British naval ship that was on an exploring expedition to various parts of South America, to Patagonia, to the Galapagos Islands. And Darwin was able to record new species of plants and animals, as well as rocks and fossils and so forth, on that voyage. Many, many systematic treatises form the basis of the nature discoveries of these voyages, and they can form beautiful, beautiful volumes, some of the most beautiful books ever published. You may have seen copies, for example, of Audubon's magnificent Birds of America or his Quadrupeds of America with exquisite illustrations painted, often hand-colored in with watercolors in the original books. My favorite example of this kind of book, however, are some of the astonishing British butterfly studies that were done in the 19th century. Some of these books are page after page of butterfly wings illustrated so you can help identify your own butterflies. But they're actual, physical, real butterfly wings that have been set into the pages of the book and carefully protected. If you can imagine buying a book which has hundreds or even thousands of butterfly wings mounted in beautiful order and arrangement. These natural history books are the basic stuff. They answer the existence questions of biology. Today, the search for life goes on in earnest, and special attention is being paid to extreme environments where we never thought we'd see life, looking for microbes in Arctic waters, frigid waters, in boiling hot springs at Yellowstone, at the deepest portions of the ocean where black, hot volcanic waters are coming out of the ground. We find life. And the discovery of these life forms and other characteristic life forms is becoming a very important part of biology today. It answers the existence questions. Quite a number of scientists are also searching for life on other worlds. Some scientists scrutinize the meteorites that are thought to have come from Mars, looking for one-celled life in those. Others search the skies for extraterrestrial intelligence in the SETI program, about which we'll learn a lot more in Lecture 60, the last lecture of this series. In spite of these intensive efforts, most biologists would agree that existence questions are still merely prelude to other questions about the origin, about process, even about applied questions of life. Now, the second kind of question, origin questions. The origin of life is a question of deep religious, philosophical, and scientific interest. Many people have asked questions about the origin of life for thousands of years. And as we're going to see in Lecture 54, the scientific pursuit of the origin of life has to presuppose that life is a natural process, perhaps an inevitable process. It's a chemical process that's amenable to laboratory investigation. If life is a miracle, then its origin is beyond the realm of science, because science can't study miracles. Science has to study reproducible, verifiable sorts of aspects of nature. And a miracle is outside that realm. And if life is a miracle, then so be it. Science will just have to accept that fact. The origin of life on Earth, we know, is an extremely ancient event, and therefore an inaccessible event. The Earth's oldest rocks, which are 3.8 billion years old, have tiny microscopic fossils of one-celled life. So life began very, very long time ago, where we don't have much record. The search for life on other worlds is also very closely tied to origins, because if we discover life elsewhere in other parts of the universe, it would imply that life is a common, perhaps an inevitable chemical reaction that just occurs on worlds that have liquid water. And that would be a profound step in understanding origins. Okay, now we come to the third kind of scientific question. These are process questions. They explore how organisms work, and it's amongst the most basic questions in all of biology. Many studies in genetics, for example, focus on the functioning of genes, the coded instructions for the individual enzymes that control chemical reactions in your body. There's other research that focuses on the mechanisms by which organisms evolve over time. We have developmental biologists whose whole life is devoted to understanding how you go from a single cell to a multicellular organism, particularly in humans. The question of going from a single fertilized egg to 100 trillion cells, where every cell is in its right place with its right function, that's an amazing scientific quest. At a larger scale, ecologists are trying to investigate the interaction of different organisms and the environment with organisms in complex ecosystems. So they also are interested in these process questions. And then at last we come to applied questions, which play a very special role in biological research. That's because we're living organisms. Medical research is by far the largest single scientific endeavor in the world. Finding cures for cancer, for AIDS, for heart disease, arthritis, Alzheimer's disease, on and on and on. There's so many human afflictions. And medical research, which is rooted in biology, is the key to finding those cures. Another very important area of biological research for humans is agricultural research, finding new crops, finding a way to grow crops faster, more efficiently, pesticides. So there are all sorts of applied questions that apply to biology relating to our food source. We are, again, living things, and applied questions in biology are never far from us. Well, on to the third and final segment of this introductory lecture on biology. Before looking at life in more detail, it's important to think about names, the field of taxonomy. It's a formalized procedure for classifying and naming life forms. Now, this is not at the forefront of science these days. We have to admit that. Yet nomenclature always plays a central role in science. You can't talk about objects in nature without naming them. Scientists have to be able to communicate. So they not only have to name every kind of organism, but also they have to be able to name all the different parts of organisms. Nomenclature was an especially severe problem in my own field of mineralogy in the 19th century. Just to give you an example of how important nomenclature can be. Each nation's mineralogists had their own set of terms for minerals, and the miners in those countries had their own mining terms. Well, this led to chaos. The common mineral calcite. Calcite is a mineral found all over the world, and there are more than a dozen names for calcite. It was called calcareous spar. It was called dogtooth spar. It was called argentine, lublinite, satin spar, and many other names for one mineral. Miners used a completely different set of names. They had marvelous descriptive names: dry bones ore, dark red silver ore, that's pretty useful, bell metal ore, and so forth. Some minerals not only had many different names, but sometimes the same name was used in different countries for different minerals. For example, both calcite and gypsum were called satin spar in different parts of Europe. So this was chaos. Scientists just can't communicate in that way. You know, also, another reason why nomenclature is important is that sometimes you can't recognize a new phenomenon unless you have a name for it. Let me tell you a story about an equatorial African tribe that, before being introduced to Europeans, had only 4 words for color. They knew red, they knew brown, they knew blue, they knew green. They did not have a word for yellow. And it was not until miners came in and said, there are diamonds all around your area. All you need to do is look for these little yellow stones. And since the people of that area did not know the word for yellow, they hadn't distinguished that as a separate color or a separate idea until they were shown it. And then they introduced the word yellow to the society, and they were able to find the stones much more easily because they had a name for the phenomenon. By the way, the English language has something over 3,000 different names for colors. It's the most sophisticated color designation of any language, and probably it means that people in North America, or people who speak English, may have a more sophisticated sense of different colors than other societies have, just by virtue of the fact there's so many names for different colors. Okay, the Linnaean system. The Linnaean system is the way that we arrange and describe and catalog living things. It's a hierarchical classification, much like the way an address works. When you write a letter to somebody, you give an address from top to bottom. You define the country, you define the state, you define the city, the street, the building, then the room, and then the person. And in this hierarchical classification, you can reach anybody in the world just about with a very simple few lines of information. Well, the Linnaean system works exactly the same way. You define a kingdom, a phylum, a class, an order, then a family, a genus, and a species. So humans, just let me give you an example. Humans are the kingdom of animals. We're in the phylum of chordates, the subphylum of vertebrates, all the animals with bony backbones. We're in the class of mammals. Those are animals whose mothers suckle the young. The order of primates, which grasp things. Family of hominids, the genus Homo, and the species Sapiens. The common shorthand when dealing with this very complex nomenclature system is to just cite the genus and species. It's what's called a binomial nomenclature. So, for example, we're members of Homo sapiens, Homo being the genus, sapiens being the species. And you've heard a lot of these binomial names, for example, Tyrannosaurus rex, the bacterium E. coli. These are examples of the binomial nomenclature. The Linnaean system today recognizes 5 major kingdoms. But I've got to tell you, this number is subject to change. When I was in grade school, there were only 2 kingdoms, plants and animals. And then shortly thereafter, there were 3. They added fungi. In another few years, it's very likely there'll be 6 rather than the current 5. But let me tell you about those 5. We have Monera. They're single-celled organisms without internal structures called the nucleus, the cell nucleus. Now, there are some taxonomists that want to split Monera into 2 kingdoms, the Archaebacter and just the straight bacteria, or the N bacteria. And this is a big matter of debate now. We'll talk about the genetic implications of this a little bit later in the course. But for now, just remember Monera as the single-celled organisms without nucleus, the Protista, the single-celled organisms with a nucleus. Then you have fungi. They're multicellular organisms that get energy and nutrients by absorbing material from their surroundings. Plants are all the multicellular organisms that get their energy from the sun by the process of photosynthesis. And 5th, the animals. Those are multicellular organisms that get their energy and nutrients by eating other organisms. This matter of species in taxonomy is not a simple one. It's not always easy to tell what a species is. The simplest definition that people have used for a long time is that if 2 organisms can mate and produce fertile offspring, they're of the same species. And there are counterexamples. For example, 2 horses can produce young horses that can then produce more horses, so they're members of the same species. But a horse and a donkey produce a mule which is infertile, so horses and donkeys aren't of the same species. Well, that sounds simple enough, but let me tell you the story about a small bird that lives on Java. Now, Java is characterized by a whole series of parallel, lush tropical valleys, and these valleys are separated by very high mountain ranges, so communication between the valleys is not easy. Let's call 4 adjacent valleys A, B, C, and D. And imagine this. You have this kind of bird living in all 4 valleys. Birds from Valley A and B can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Birds from B and C can interbreed and produce fertile offsprings. And birds from C and D also can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. But yes, you guessed it, if you try to breed A and D, they don't produce fertile offspring. So what's a species? How do you define it? If A and B are the same species, and B and C are the same species, and C and D are the same species, but A is not the same species as D, we get into a real conundrum. But you know, nature does what nature wants to do. It doesn't conform to our definitions. Nature is much more complex, and that's why nomenclature can be very complex. Of course, the situation gets even more complex when you look at fossils. The fossil record is filled with objects that vary one from another by subtle ways. Are they different species? Are they same? Could they have interbred? Who knows? So you have to use taxonomy. You have to use various forms of just the morphology, the shape of those fossils, and make your best guess and qualify it, because nature is what nature is. In any case, in terms of living things, all life can in one way or another be classified according to this Linnaean system. And at present, there are something like 1.8 or 1.9 known million, 1.8 or 1.9 million known species. But how many species are there in the world that haven't been identified? It's difficult to estimate, but one way of doing it is to plot the number of known species versus time. For example, the number of birds in 1800 and 1810 and 1820 and so forth versus time. And you see a gradual increase in the leveling off. And once you see that leveling off, you know you're getting close to the number of total species. That implies that there's been a constant looking for birds or for mammals or some other group. But some types of organisms are tremendously underrepresented because no one's looked for them. Microbes in particular, tiny single-celled organisms, also very small microscopic organisms that are multicelled, some of the animals, for example. And so people have conducted exhaustive tests on small plots of land just to see how many species there are, and it turns out we may not know very much at all about life on Earth. By some estimates, we know now less than 10% of all species. Indeed, some people estimate that we only know 1% of all the species, that 99% of all the species on Earth are unknown. And furthermore, it's absolutely been shown that you can dig up a cubic foot of dirt anywhere in North America. You can subject that dirt to intensive analysis, and you'll find dozens of species that no one has ever described before. Even in your backyard, there's so much life, there's such a diversity of life, and so much of it is microscopic, it's very difficult to find. Well, to summarize, I've introduced biology by considering 3 topics. First of all, what is life? And my best definition at this point is just the 6 shared characteristics. All organisms are highly complex chemical systems. They're all composed of cells. They all obtain and use energy. They all reproduce using the same genetic mechanisms. They all grow and develop. And finally, all organisms respond to changes in their environment. How can we study life? The second point of this lecture. You can do it at many different scales, from molecules to planets, and with many types of questions, both basic questions and applied. And finally, how do we name living things? We use the Linnaean binomial nomenclature that provides a very convenient, though by no means preordained, way of describing life. So in the next lecture, we're going to consider some of the varied strategies that are adopted by living things.